Okay, thank you, Julie. Okay, welcome everyone to the IIRSM East Midlands branch webinar. We have got a Q&A function at the top right hand corner if you wish to ask any questions. For anything else, please use the chat function. So tonight we have got Neil Molyneux, who's Director and Principal Consultant of Effective Health and Safety Management Limited. And I'll hand over to you, Neil.
Okay, thanks, Dan. Well, good evening, everyone. I'm assuming that you can all see and hear me okay, unless I hear to the contrary. So thanks for today's invite. Genuinely, it's good to be here to have a chance to talk about something that certainly is interesting to me, and hopefully by the end of the session will be interesting to you as well. It's a valuable subject, I think, and hopefully something that's going to give you some useful insights and maybe a bit of food for thought. Great news, of course, that East Midlands IIRSM has now got a branch up and running, so it's good to be part of that as well. And I guess, like quite a lot of you, I've found over the years that the networking function is really important to the profession, so it's good to be here. So before I get into the subject, just a little bit about myself, and maybe to give you a bit of I guess, insight into why it's me here today talking about this particular subject before I get onto it itself. So despite my enduring good looks, he says, probably laughably, but I've got the appearance function turned up full. And in fact, I'm looking like I've got a bit of a suntan, I think, which is nice. I've been in health and safety for the best part of 35 years now. Originally, I was an HSC inspector based in the West Midlands and had 10 years with them inspecting most of the things that were happening at the time. Quite a lot of engineering. Quite a lot of general manufacturing, which was food, drink, clothing, printing, all sorts of stuff like that. Fair bit of construction and a couple of years specialising in foundries, which I was never quite sure whether that was a sort of, promotion or whether it was a punishment. But it was interesting times, a couple of years doing nothing but foundries. I then had 10 years as head of health and safety with one of the regional electricity companies. So I was still in the West Midlands at the time. So originally it was Midlands Electricity Board. Obviously you had East Midlands Electricity Board over here, and both organisations obviously have been through a lot of changes and buyouts over the years. Interesting times, because that was fairly soon after privatisation, so a high risk industry there in a sector that was changing a lot, and also of course a company that was changing a lot as well. So sorry to report that I've seen fatalities from both sides of the fence. I had a couple of years with the Learning and Skills Council. Maybe one or two people listening today might recognise that. That was a government body in the past charged with the funding for work-based learning and further education. Quite an interesting take on it there. That was about trying to get health and safety a much more integrated part of a high-quality learning experience. I then had 18 months with a logistics multinational as their European health and safety manager, and then I set up and been working myself for the last 15 years or so, I guess. Quite a lot of work, which I guess is almost a sort of critical friend type work, whether it's auditing or assurance. But in recent years, I've found myself doing more and more on the management training side, which is sort of linked in a bit today, will become a bit more obvious. So why this particular subject and why my interest in it? Well, I guess after 35 years, you find yourself gravitating towards the bit which perhaps interests you more, the bits that you've not necessarily done that much in. So over the last 10 years or so, I would say, although maybe even a bit further back than that, I've developed an interest in what I would call good governance in health and safety. And I'm going to obviously explain a bit more about that in a moment. And I guess in lots of ways, this is really, from my point of view, almost a sort of natural evolution of where health and safety has sort of taken me and my interest in it. And I think, as health and safety professionals, although we've got probably a lot better at engaging with senior management on health and safety at a more strategic level, we've perhaps not always made the progress that we've wanted to, and it's still obviously a pretty important subject. I mean, we've been through quite a lot of different phases over the years, whether it's total quality management, whether it's loss control, whether it's good health and safety is good business, whether it's some of the more recent sort of new view safety 2 type approaches. But for me, good governance in health and safety is, as I would term it, is this sort of natural evolution. So that's where I'm coming from. It's an area that I've got a general interest in, and it's good to be able to share with you today a bit of sort of thinking around this subject. It's also a subject that I've been developing my knowledge in, if you like, outside health and safety. So as well as my safety qualifications, I've done the Institute of Directors Certificate and Diploma in Company Direction over recent years. And I've also had one or two positions myself in terms of trustee and independent members on various sort of boards and committees to try and put some of this into practice as well. And I want to be able to, share some of those insights with you today. So just before I start, a couple of other things. I appreciate people are here today from the point of view, I'm assuming, of sort of CPD, and hopefully I'm going to give you some interesting things to sort of take away and reflect on. But what I would say is maybe if you can listen from two perspectives tonight, it might give you an added sort of dimension to some of the things I'm going to say. So as well as, I guess, with our health and safety professionals hats on, maybe have a listen or imagine you are listening to some of this from the point of view of a director or board members, and some of this almost as a sort of briefing, if you like, around some of these subjects, because quite a lot of the underpinning themes that I'm going to be talking about are common themes, and they're themes that I talk to different audiences about, whether it's health and safety professionals, whether it's senior managers, whether it's boards, or whether it's, as it was last week, I did a session for some company secretaries. A lot of these underpinning themes are there, which I think is one of the reasons why this is an important subject, and something hopefully you'll agree with me is worth sort of thinking about. So let me start. So today's session, I'm going to talk about, well, 5 things really, I guess. So I'm going to start in a minute by saying a bit about, well, what is this thing called good governance in health and safety, this title that I'm using? Why is it important and why is it useful? So I'm going to use that as a sort of introduction. I'm then going to move on to talk about what I've called there the new strategic context for health and safety, because I guess when I look at this area, and particularly through this perspective of good governance, I very much take the view that we are in a new strategic context for health and safety. And I use that very much as part of the way, I guess, of trying to get this sort of engagement and buy-in with these different audiences around this subject. I want to say a little bit about 2 particular topics today, and obviously we're limited for time, but I've chosen these 2 because I'm hoping they're going to be interesting to you. I want to say a bit about board effectiveness for health and safety. So what I'm going to do there is to pick up on a key good governance theme and to show how we can make the links between that and health and safety. What I'm also going to talk about then is, I've called it there an example, a board manifesto for health and safety, which again is another sort of strand, if you like, of, let's say, speaking the same sort of language, adapting some of these themes around good governance and how we can use those to not just our advantage, but to the advantage of boards and directors as well. And then I'll finish up before the Q&A. I'll give you 3 useful references that I think would be worth following up if you go away from today wanting to find out a bit more. So in terms of the first 2, I'll deal with these together. What is it? Why is it important and useful? So what is it? This is my, I won't say necessarily definition, but take on it here. So there are 2 aspects to this. One is that from a health and safety professional's point of view, I very much see this as being an opportunity. It's an opportunity for us to hopefully increase our knowledge in an important area, and through that to increase our confidence and ultimately our ability to influence a key audience, i.e. senior managers, directors and boards. What's it about? And I'll explain more about some of the elements of this in a moment, but overall it's about, at its core, helping directors and boards to see health and safety more strategically through the lens and ethos of good corporate governance. I put corporate there in brackets because we may be talking about corporate governance. Perhaps if we're more looking at the private sector, if we're looking at other sectors, we might be talking more generally about good governance. But the themes are the same, so it's no problem. It's just to make that slight distinction. And it's about making the links between key good governance topics and health and safety. Some examples there: leadership, engagement, culture, risk management, obviously close to your hearts, accountability, stakeholder relations. So just to go through that and pull out 1 or 2 things as to why that's maybe an important opportunity and helpful to us and others. One of the things there is that I've highlighted, well, it's a way of helping directors and boards. And really what I'm doing there is making a distinction between maybe in some cases, perhaps our usual audience at a senior level for health and safety. So if we get the chief exec, if we get their direct reports in a room, if we've got a relationship with them, we're doing pretty well. But we're also talking here more collectively about getting the board engaged in health and safety as well, and using good governance in health and safety as a vehicle to help us do that. So in effect, we're looking to try and take this a stage further, or to do it in a way that maybe gets boards more proactively and actively involved in some of these issues. Very much an opportunity to have a more strategic discussion, I would say, around elements of health and safety and good governance and health and safety where they come together. And I've said here through the lens and ethos of good corporate governance. And I've picked out ethos there to make a point that one of the themes, I guess, in good governance over recent years, and it's a similar theme maybe to health and safety, is that sometimes people look at this and they think about corporate governance and they think that it's about annual reporting, they think that it's about the glossy reports, the ticks in the box, all that side of it. And maybe there is an element of that. But one of the things that has happened in good governance and good corporate governance over recent years is that there's been more emphasis on the ethos. What's it there for? What's it driving? How is it helpful to the organisation? What sort of behaviours are we talking about? So it's not just about paperwork, it's about the things that sit behind it, which is another reason why, as you'll see in a minute, there's some very good links to be made. So yes, it's about making the links, and you can see there that a number of key topics in good governance are, surprise, surprise, or pleasant surprise maybe, also key sorts of topics that we're interested in: leadership, engagement, culture, risk management, accountability, stakeholder relations inside and outside the organisation. So hopefully that initial insight starts to give you a flavour that there are advantages in knowing more about this subject and being in a position to start making some of these links, which obviously I'm going to go on and say more about. Before I do that, let me just say a little bit about, I guess in many ways, let's say, elements of the definition of good governance and good corporate governance. So there are a number of items, I guess, and elements associated with this. And if I said, perhaps in the private sector, what is corporate governance about? One of the definitions you're likely to get is that first one that I've pulled out there. It's about the system of direction and control of the company. Okay, that's pretty well established, but if we break it down a bit further and start to look at some of the other elements associated with this and the way that governance has developed, we've also got this key theme of accountability, both internally and of course externally. And I think it's fair to say most of us would come to the conclusion that people's expectations, stakeholder expectations for organisations to be well run, to be well governed, has increased over recent years for a variety of reasons. I think we'll also agree that there is now a recognition that organisations need to have a longer term focus. They need to be sustainable. We can see some of this going back to maybe the banking crisis of 2008. Setting and achieving key objectives, assuming the organisation has got clarity around what they are, is a really important part of good governance of organisations, as is generating positive outcomes, particularly perhaps if you're more in the public sector. What are you there for? You're there to deliver positive outcomes for your stakeholders. Stakeholders and relationships, really important dimensions and elements of good governance, as is, I've called it there, corporate citizenship, this expectation, I guess, that well-run organisations are going to have a wider worldview than just their bottom line or what they're there to achieve for their most obvious stakeholders. And we've seen that over recent years develop through different sort of phases: corporate social responsibility, ESG, environment, social and governance, both of which I'll come back to a little bit later. So hopefully that gives you a flavour for some of those developments, I guess, and elements of definitions which sit there. So first question, and this is a common theme I found myself asking when I'm, I guess, presenting and discussing around some of these elements I'm covering today, albeit fairly quickly. But here's something to think about. How many of these do we think, or do you think, are linked with health and safety? How many of these sorts of elements and dimensions of definition of good governance are potentially linked with, or health and safety could be linked with them? One of the answers I found that comes out quite a lot when we start to examine some of this stuff and talk around it is all of them, or potentially all of them. And although we've got limited time today to talk this through, I think we can see that when we're talking about systems of direction and control, particularly maybe on the control side for some people, there's elements there of control, assurance, health and safety, the links in there, accountability. Well, that's clearly very relevant, both internally and externally. Longer term focus and sustainability. We don't have to look far for examples of organisations that have maybe taken their eye off the ball in the short term, cut the maintenance budgets, whatever it happens to be, and paid the price later on. Setting and achieving key objectives, positive outcomes. I think we can see the links there. Stakeholders, relationships, corporate citizenship. So, if we had more time, we could go through that in more detail. But I think the answer to that question, well, how many of these are potentially linked with health and safety, is, well, really all of them, or potentially all of them. How often do we maybe have that conversation? How often do boards have that conversation? How often do we facilitate that sort of conversation? Probably less frequently. Okay, let's move on a bit more. Why is it important and useful? So 3 things here that I would highlight. First one comes back to that point that I've made, that in fact there is a lot of synergy here between these key issues that are on the radar from a good governance point of view, and the more strategic things that we're also interested in as forward-looking health and safety professionals. Mentioned those already, but hopefully that's becoming fairly clear. Number 2, pretty important. We've talked about this in the past. How do we speak the same language with senior management and boards? We've made attempts to do this. I think one of the strengths of this sort of approach is that it does allow us to do that in a genuine way that is seen as being very relevant and also pretty strategic. And associated with that point, it also enables us to challenge constructively, which is important, on the board's own turf, I've said there. And the reason I've said there is because accountability for good governance for a well-run organisation sits firmly with the board. And if we cast our minds back and, back to the stage where I guess health and safety was developing, and there was focus through the original sets of management regs and HSG 65, and as it was at the time, BS 8800, this recognition that organisations need some management systems really to, I guess, encompass their approach to health and safety. I remember asking the question, and I've done so over the years, trying to get that sort of response from senior management. Well, who's responsible for managing health and safety? Trying to put the emphasis there on the point about management. Which is a good question, an interesting discussion, but unfortunately 9 times out of 10, the answer you get to that is, well, we're all responsible for managing our own health and safety, which, yes, we are on one level. But in terms of good governance, that's a harder issue to duck. And I'm not suggesting boards necessarily want to duck it. What I'm doing is trying to make the point that we're very much talking the same language here and addressing this on the board's own turf. It's very hard to say, well, everyone's responsible for the good governance of the organisation. It clearly sits with the board. And that's another reason I think why it gives us this positive foot in the door. Okay, let me say a little bit now about the new strategic context for health and safety. Now, this is an interesting one. As I say, I'm using this, I guess, almost as another way of getting this foot in the door to try and make the point in particular to the intended audience that there's been quite a lot happening in health and safety over recent years, and that from a leadership point of view, from a director and board point of view, one of the things they need to be is aware of this bigger picture. Before we get into the weeds of the detail, we can talk perhaps a bit more strategically about the way that things are developing and how we can make some of these links for them. Interesting, for those of you who've got 45,001, you'll know that context was one of the new requirements there, and I've certainly had this discussion a little bit over recent years where people have sort of come back on this point and said, yeah, maybe I can see a little bit why this point about organisations thinking about the context and the changing context is an important part of this overall discussion of what the safety management system is there for, to achieve, and how it fits in as part of the organisation's overall approach to good governance and risk management. So, limited time today, so all I'm going to do is to give you a single slide behind each of these 4 headings, just to, I guess, demonstrate some of the things that I would typically pull out to try and make this point around the new context and some of these important developments and how and where they start to link in with good corporate governance. So There have been a number of important changes and developments over recent years, and I think we are justifiable, and certainly I feel justified in talking about this sort of new or changed in a developing context. And I think what that means is that there's the element, I guess, of boards needing to recognise maybe that a more strategic approach is needed because of some of these changes and developments, but also turning it round to a positive approach here, that in fact there are a number of advantages to be thinking more strategically about some of this stuff. Not least of all, the fact that the board can perhaps be more effective in applying some of the techniques of good corporate governance and what they're doing to health and safety at a more strategic level, rather than perhaps either perceiving or somehow being under the impression that they need to become health and safety technical experts somehow, or the usual sort of impression that you might get or response when you talk about health and safety for the training for the board. People's initial assumption is going to be technical training, not necessarily something that lines up a bit more strategically. So these four headings there, I've just pulled those out. They're ones that make sense to me. There's nothing more to it than that, and hopefully they'll make sense to you in a moment when I just share the slides that sit behind them. So I'm going to talk a little bit about safety, health and well-being, what I've called their legal and reputation, good practice alignment, and then HSE focus and expectations. On the right-hand side there, the aim of that is to make the point that COVID, of course, has been a major impact and a major change to the strategic context over recent years. And that, in effect, has had an impact and effect on a number of these areas. And in fact, a number of these areas are interrelated. So I've separated them out for the purpose of today, but of course they're interlinked. So COVID has had a bearing on, I guess, how we talk about health at work. It's had a bearing on the types of conversations we've had. It's had a bearing on the amount of communication and cooperation on the positive side. It's had a bearing on our risk management approaches, business continuity, lots of things. And probably you've sat in on webinars, I'm sure, and been thinking yourself about how we carry forward the positive elements of that as well. So let me just share a slide with you behind each of these, and this is where perhaps I'm throwing these out a bit as well in the context of different audiences, thinking about some of this stuff as well as you as health and safety professionals. So the first slide here is really picking up that theme that if we look at the balance between health, safety, and more recently, well-being, it has changed and is changing quite significantly and quite importantly. I think it's fair to say that, you know, although we've had the Health and Safety at Work Act since 1974, a lot of us would recognise that health has been the poor relation for a whole variety of reasons, and a lot of those very understandable and justifiable. So one of the things that we can start to flag up in terms of this bigger picture and take the opportunity to put this in the context of this is these changes taking place. HSE, as you'll know, these days produces some quite accessible publications on these. We've moved on from the days of the sort of Excel spreadsheets only, so we've got some quite visually attractive information. Obviously, I've just taken a couple of headline figures there from the most recent version of the stats, and it's quite easy to obviously make this point that when we look at some of the figures associated with, well, for instance, work-related stress, depression, anxiety compared to work-related musculoskeletal disorders. When we look further down and looking at the number of people that are dying still typically in a year from lung-related diseases, 12,000 compared to 123 or whatever it was, being killed through, let's say, more traditional safety concerns in the previous year. You know, some of those figures come out quite loudly, don't they? We can make the point, which is made quite nicely here, I think, that when we look at HSE's most recent strategy, which of course was released in the middle of last year and takes us forward for the next 10 years, we can see that work-related ill health is writ fairly large there as part of their first strategic objective. So, you know, it's quite a good point, I think, to be able to make that comparison, that there is a redressing of the balance between health and safety. That is a good thing. It's going to change and develop over the years as HSE look at these areas in more detail. We can see that there is this emphasis on work-related ill health, particularly as it relates to a specific focus on mental health and stress. And we can see, of course, that there are some very clear linkings here with well-being and how that's coming into part of the picture as well. And just a quote there from HSE talking about the strategy designed to keep us focused on tackling both new new and traditional risks. So HSE's role is changing as well. We've got the building safety regulator. HSE gets involved with pesticides and some other aspects of it, environmental management as well. So it's a good point in time to really, I guess, surface this and have a discussion around what the main regulator strategy is and where health is now starting to sit in that. And that is quite a, you know, a point well made, I've found over recent years to some of these audiences as well as ourselves as professionals. Very quickly on the legal and reputational side, and I try to move away from using this to drive these conversations, but I think we'd be remiss if we didn't, as professionals, take the opportunity to make sure that senior management, directors and boards are fully on the page when it comes to some of this stuff. So here's a slide that really pulls in 2 or 3 sort of elements, I guess, of this. Most organizations, of course, will know that in terms of reputational damage, social media, how news and bad news travels quickly, you know, this is a key issue for people, and something that whatever 10 years ago, certainly 20 years ago, wasn't the same sort of concern that it is now. As people say, everyone is a journalist these days. Although it was a few years ago now, the definitive sentencing guideline, of course, is starting to have a fairly significant effect, and I've just pulled out there, albeit you know, an example, if you like, towards the sort of top rather than the bottom of the cases in terms of financial penalty. But there are quite a lot of incidents these days where senior management, you know, can see that the financial penalty associated with getting things wrong now is far more significant than it was, as well as the reputational damage side. They can also see, and this is an example here, where people don't actually have to be injured. It's to do with the risk that is being created by what people do, or perhaps what they don't do, and how this plays out. And in this particular case, they can probably also see that from a strategic risk management point of view, if you happen to be that large civil engineering firm that has been fined £4 million for this, you are probably going to find that your relationships with some of your clients and would-be clients and ability to get on tender lists is going to be fairly significantly impacted. So in terms of strategic risk management and where some of these things and good governance now leaves organizations, here's another, I guess, very real example of where health and safety is starting to be a much more significant, and to use the terminology, I guess, that you would see in, for instance, a strategic report of a large construction company, a principal risk to the business. And if you look in the strategic reports of large construction companies, you might be quite surprised to see the amount of coverage now that health and safety gets and the way that it's being talked about in the context of strategic risk management. Leading health and safety at work, I've put that in there. Again, that's nothing new per se, but the reason it's there and the reason I take the opportunity to include it or encompass it in this is because twofold. One is it's a good opportunity to make the point that, in effect, when we're talking about corporate manslaughter and the links with that there is, in effect, a sort of de facto benchmark, if you like, for leading health and safety at work. And certainly if you've sat in, as I'm sure some of you will have done over recent years, with board presentations from solicitors, you will have seen them making great play on this particular publication. I think we can use it a bit more positively, as well as just wielding it as a big stick, because we can tie it into good leadership and using that as a if you like, a protective measure as well. And I'll come on to that in a short while. But also something else that I found quite useful to pull out in relation to corporate manslaughter leadership and the role, I guess, that the board and senior management directors have to play. So that's just an extract there from section 8.3a of the Corporate Manslaughter Act. And I've just reproduced the little bit there that talks about what juries would be able to and asked to think about. And the quote there talks about attitudes, policies, systems, or accepted practices within the organisation that were likely to encourage any such failure. Obviously, the failure being the gross failure and the death associated with it. Now, that's my expression there. And I put the circle around it, but those are very much, certainly some of those, what I would call cultural factors, attitudes, systems, accepted practices. So very much making the point here that although senior management might think and perhaps want to take comfort from thinking that when something goes badly wrong in a work-related situation, that somehow it's a one-off, it's never happened before, there were never any warning signs, there were never any normalized procedures develop in the background. All my experience, and I'm probably sure a lot of your experience, will have shown that is very rarely, if ever, the case. So to flag up that, as well as leadership being important, this issue of cultural factors and the fact that if something does go seriously wrong, whether it's corporate manslaughter or health and safety law, that the way a management team, if you like, is approaching health and safety, the way that it is approaching these cultural sorts of things, the way it is looking at are the gaps between accepted practices and what's happening on the ground is really important. And I guess to know that those sort of cultural factors are likely to come under the microscope is also something I think that is an important part of the way this context is changing. But again, something we can, I guess, yes, to use to get people to sit up and take notice, but to turn it around the other way and to say, well, okay, if cultural factors are important, what can we do? What can you do through good leadership, through good governance, through good risk management to be on top of these things proactively, so we can turn this round to a positive as well. Good practice, alignment and integration, quite a lot here potentially to talk about. Again, limited on time today, but I've pulled out a number of things there. I've said on the left-hand side some of the topics that are definitely on the board radar. Risk management, of course, very much so. And I know if you look at the IIRSM website, it very much makes this point through some of the courses and things that it's doing, that risk management is very much more centre stage now than it's been, which is good for organisations, but ourselves as well. As organisations and as boards, I guess, perceive the value in a more integrated and strategic approach to risk management, and something that they are actively involved in at a strategic level as well. It provides a really good opportunity for us to expand our own thinking and approach into that area. Organisational culture, really important. That is a really hot topic in good governance over recent years. You know, and we look at some of the governance failures that have taken place when they're whether they've been in the private or public sector over recent years. We've seen the usual sort of pattern evolve. Something goes seriously wrong. The initial response of the organisation is that it's a rogue individual or whatever. Surprise, surprise, 6 months down the line, we find, in fact, there's been a sort of culture sitting there in the background, a gap between what the organisation, I guess, has said or what it thinks is happening in practice and the reality day to day. So a really good opportunity to be thinking around this point about organisational culture, why it's important to boards, and again, how we can capitalise on that. Similarly, ESG, environment, social and governance and sustainability. This whole issue that, particularly if we're talking about, as IIRSM have been doing over the recent last 18 months, 2 years or so, let's call it social sustainability, that, you know, when we're thinking about, well, what makes an organisation or socially sustainable, both internally and externally, the way that it treats people, the way that it treats its own people is a really important part of that. And for those of you perhaps who haven't seen it, there's a link in there to the IIRSM Catch the Wave campaign, which very much picks up this bigger picture and theme of social sustainability, and where health and safety and the importance of human capital fits into that. Wellbeing and mental health, mentioned that a little bit already, but again, we can see, and I'm sure you will have seen this yourself, that this is very much on the board radar in a way that it hasn't been until the last sort of 2 or 3 years or so. Globally, some developments there. Stakeholder expectations, really important. Number of ISO global standards, not just 45001, but we've got the revised risk management standards. We've got standards relating to business continuity. We've got standards relating to human-centered organizations, a number of things again that sort of pull some of these strands together. And of course, we've got the 45003 supporting, in effect, good mental health at work. And of course, the interest and expectations in relation to organizations influencing positively and working in partnership, and certainly paying sufficient due diligence to both their procurement and supply chains. So again, a whole host of areas there that most organizations recognize as being much more important and prominent in terms of well-run organizations, that we also have a chance to make a link into. And the last one, very quickly, something taken from an old favourite, HSG 65, which I think is perhaps still a little bit underutilised. You know, HSE quite often got there first with some of this, or certainly have taken the opportunity to play back, I guess, good practice. And although we've not had a revision since 2013, this is an illustration that I use quite often and seems to make the point quite well. And I quite often show this and make the point that when I think about my time in health and safety, there's almost been three sort of stages or phases, if you like, of the way that it's developed. And again, if we had more time, I'd probably put my first two circles around legal compliance and competence on the right-hand side and make the point that, you know, as a compliance activity, this is the starting point, maybe still is for some smaller organisations and less well informed out there. Health and safety is largely about being legally compliant, making sure that you've got competence in particular where you need it, whether it's forklift trucks or whatever it happens to be. As time went on, again, going back perhaps to the start of the 1990s, this whole issue of management coming in, managing for health and safety being an important part of how organisations approach this. So I'd probably put a couple of circles around those points. But for the purpose of today, the reason I've circled the other points is because I think these very much tie in with this move towards a more strategic approach and helping us to be able to make the link into good governance. So bit sad, I guess, that I did this, but I went and had a look at the previous version of HSG 65 and risk profiling wasn't mentioned at all. It's in there quite a lot in the current version, and I think the reason it's in there, and certainly the reason I would say it's in there, is that this is really saying to managers in particular and leaders, yes, you've got your individual risk assessments, and some of you may have hundreds of those. But if I sat down and asked the question to your board and your directors, what are your top 5 health and safety risks? Why at this point in time, and how confident are you about the controls, both strategic and operational? It will probably generate quite an interesting conversation. So this issue of the link in to understand what your risk profile is, what that means in terms of health and safety at a more strategic level, I think is a really important one and helps us to move the conversation on and ties in very nicely, I think, with some of the key messages coming out from IIRSM as well. Worker involvement, always been a part, I guess, of the HSE's approach, but if we're talking about stakeholder engagement, getting the sort of buy-in, the cultural changes, this is another area where we can very usefully make the links in there. We can see that as well as having the sort of management, the transactional side of managing health and safety, of course, leadership is writ large in HSG 65, which ties in directly. And then HSE quite nicely has also gone on to say, well, it's not just about managing for health and safety, it's also about thinking how that fits in with your overall business risk management picture. Made the example earlier about perhaps some of the larger construction companies where managing business risks is very much part of the overall approach, or needs to be, to health and safety. So a simple illustration, but one really which I think says quite well pictorially these extra elements that HSC in terms of its expectations and things that it's focusing on, as well as the obvious ones, is very helpful and useful to make when we're thinking about this bigger picture and how some of these things link together. Okay, conscious time is ticking on, but 5 more minutes should give me time just to cover off these things. So that's the new strategic context, and why I think that is there is a good opportunity to talk in that way around some of these subjects. Obviously, with more time, you can pull out and talk in more detail and tailor some of these things very specifically to the particular company. But let me pick up this point about board effectiveness for you, because this is where we're now, I guess, seeing some of those potential links. How can we make them in practice? What have we got out there that helps us maybe to do that? So this is a publication that the Financial Reporting Council, which is the body that at the moment still produces the UK Corporate Governance Code, put together. Now, although the code applies to, in effect, listed and, if you like, larger companies, the fact is it has a trickle-down effect and a good practice effect through other codes, whether they're in the public sector, whether they're in different sectors, whether they're in expectations of larger organisations and the relationships they've got with their smaller suppliers and subcontractors. And it also represents, anyway, good practice, which is why it was produced. So what this does is, in effect, it puts some meat on the bones of the UK Corporate Governance Code, and it produces this specific guidance to try and give boards, as I would say, a much better insight into the ethos, let's say, of good corporate governance, the sorts of behaviours, the sorts of things that boards should be thinking about, they should be doing, they should be reflecting on. As well as considering governance about the reporting side, you know, the ticks in the boxes of the public reports. And again, with more time, obviously we could explore these, but what I've done today for the purpose today is just to pull out for you, hopefully, some pretty obvious links where you can see that these things can be really helpful, both in terms of helping the board to understand where health and safety potentially fits in, and also maybe giving them confidence that if they are pushing towards good governance, there is a win-win here between that and applying the same sorts of behaviours and approaches to health and safety. So in the guidance, there's a very clear focus on, not just board reporting, but board behaviours. So expression there, very popular one, the tone from the top, turning it to health and safety. How does the board set the HSE tone from the top? Has it thought about the key sorts of health and safety behaviours that the board should be exhibiting and expecting of other leaders? Purpose, values and strategy, the real importance of the purpose, values and strategy driving where the organisation is going and being part of it. Where is health and safety going? Have we even had that conversation? What does it look like? Have we got an overall strategy? Why? How? How will we know when we're progressing towards it? Understanding legal duties, interesting one here. Again, if we had more time, I'd take you to have a look at this, but take it from me, there are certain sections of the Companies Act which, again, when you ask the question, particularly directors' duties, how many of those are potentially relevant to health and safety as well? The answer is potentially all of them. And certainly I've done some of these sessions where I've demonstrated that point and visibly seen some of the directors sitting up and taking notice when they perhaps appreciate that health and safety isn't just about health and safety legal duties, but in fact some of the Companies Act is also very relevant here as well. Values and culture, health and safety values, have we thought about that? Apart from just saying health and safety is a value, what does that mean? Have we thought about culture? Are these things aligned? What do we do to bring that about in practice? How do we know? Communication, engagement, insights. Are we having structured, effective two-way conversations? Are we building trust-based relationships, raising concerns? Very popular one at the moment, of course, psychological safety. Have we got this level of trust? Are people willing to speak up? Non-exec directors have got quite a lot of attention over recent years. This whole issue of the role to provide independent board level challenge, really interesting and important question here. Well, how does the board do that on health and safety? Do non-execs even think about it in that way? Board performance, has it made any expectations clear for health and safety? What does it expect the chief exec and executive directors to do? How is that measured or evaluated? And risk management, seen already that there's a good opening in there to be thinking about health and safety as part of an integrated and strategic, as well as purely operational and compliance based approach. And final example, just very quickly, last two slides for today. I said earlier when I started that one of the other powerful themes here is this point about speaking the same language. And just to try and demonstrate that to you, I've pulled out a couple of quotes here from the UK Corporate Governance Code. Okay, so the key point on the left-hand side, the language and wording of the principles of this code, and I've put the link there, which you'll be able to get and have a look if you wanted to. It's quite a quick read. But you'll see that there is a section in there which picks up this particular issue of board leadership and company purpose. In fact, it's the first set of principles. And there are 5 principles there listed A to E. And what I've done, and there's an article there on LinkedIn which I published 2 or 3 years ago, which again you can click through and have a read through in a bit more detail if this interests you. But at the top there, I've just reproduced what the code actually says in the principle. So this code, principle B, and it applies to all of them, but I've just picked 2 out. It says there then that the board should establish, bear with me a moment, I just need to move this around. The board should establish the company's purpose, values and strategy and to satisfy itself that these and its culture are aligned. All directors must act with integrity, lead by example and promote the desired culture. Interesting point here, just very quickly, in the same way that HSG 65 really homes in on leadership now. Prior to the 2018 version of the code, organisational culture got one passing mention in the preamble. It now appears centre stage throughout quite a lot of the code and associated guidance. If we apply that wording to health and safety in a very similar way, in this case literally just by inserting the phrase safety, health and well-being, you will actually see something there which I think could actually appear very nicely in HSG 65. We will establish our company's purpose, values and strategy for safety, health and well-being and satisfy ourselves that these and our culture are aligned. As directors, we will act with integrity, lead by example and promote the desired culture. Quite a powerful discussion, I think, around that particular point. A couple of sentences there which contain quite a lot of valuable themes and discussion points. And similarly, last slide, very quickly, Principle E. This talks about the board ensuring that workforce policies and practices are consistent with the company's values and support its long-term sustainable success, and the workforce should be able to raise any matters of concern. So two things here. One is there shouldn't be a gap between, I guess, what the policies and practices say, or the theory of them, and the reality. A very common theme to us in health and safety. And of course, over recent years, there's been this focus on the importance of whistleblowing. So the workforce should be able to raise any matters of concern, which is really what that's saying. Applying that again to health and safety, we will ensure that our policies are consistent with our company values for safety, health and well-being. So again, trying to avoid this gap between, I guess, theory and practice. And support for our long-term sustainable success. Our workforce will be able and positively encouraged, not just to raise any matters of concern, but this is where I've just expanded it and tweaked it slightly to include, obviously, a theme that we focus on as being particularly important. We're also going to try and celebrate our successes. So it's not just about employees reporting something they've got a concern about. Yes, that's important, but we want to have that positive celebration of where things go right as well. But again, hopefully that demonstrates to you that there's very much a link between not just the language there, but some really important points said quite succinctly. And the reason I use the phrase manifesto there, and if you click through and have a look at that article, you see what I'm saying is that in many ways, and you'll see this is summarized on half a page, if a board had a conversation around these principles and was asking, well, how do we apply these to health and safety in the way that I've just rephrased it very slightly, that would be, I think, a very powerful as well as strategic and interesting conversation for them to have. And again, I would say it's a really good illustration of where good corporate governance and what's happening with the ethos of good governance potentially comes together with the same sort of messages that we're trying to get out there and the sort of strategic approach that we would want to develop and facilitate. So very useful references very quickly. Again, links on those. There's a very useful IOD fact sheet on what is the role of the board. So if you wanted to find out a little bit more about, well, what are actually boards about? What are their strategic functions? Where might those things start to link in with health and safety? That's a good place to start. There is an HSE research report on best practice in corporate occupational health and safety governance, which isn't, if you like, a definitive guide, but pulls together some quite useful information and provides a sort of suggested principle-based approach. It's a few years old now, but it's still pretty good. And the last one is that one I've touched on, the Financial Reporting Council guidance on board effectiveness. Definitely worth a read, and that's a free publication as well. Final point, just before opening up for questions, if there are a few, a bit of food for thought. If you're interested in any of those themes, things that you've heard tonight, if that has generated a bit of food for thought and you'd like to maybe think about expanding your thinking in this area a little bit more, I do a course on this, strategic health and safety, how to positively challenge and support your board, which at the moment is part of the IIRSM CPD program. That gives us a chance to look at all these sorts of issues in more detail and gives people a chance to share their experience and discuss these sorts of issues with colleagues as well, which is always well received. Just another quick thought as well, in terms of courses that are available for leaders and things, there's a range of those, and I think and I guess can provide an opportunity for thinking about, well, how can some of these themes perhaps be introduced into some of that training a bit more to make them more tailored to organisations and perhaps to get leaders, boards and senior managers thinking a bit more strategically around some of these sorts of topics and strategic context that I've talked about today. So always happy to discuss that with anyone. Okay, Dan, that's me done. Sorry I've run on a little bit, but there was quite a lot of ground to cover today, and I wanted to do that in a way that hopefully had a logic to it and sort of fitted together and gave people a train of thought through what this is, why it's important, why it's an opportunity, not just for us as professionals, but for organisations as well, and then to start to give you a good flavour for some of the places, if you like, that we can see this, that's very helpful for us.
Yeah, that's brilliant. It's a very good overview. Thank you very much. We've got a couple of questions, if you don't mind.
Yeah, of course, far away.
So I had one, and also Nigel's raised one as well. So there's a lot of talk about culture, or a lot of noise about safety cultures not being tangible. So what are your thoughts on that? How would you measure or improve, or raise up to the board about this culture aspect?
Well, one of the things that I guess I found really interesting looking at this through the prism, if you like, of good governance is that there's a lot happening in this area. So again, we're limited on time today, but for instance, when we have chance to maybe talk about culture and some of the work that's going on in this area, there's one or two really good examples of work that's been sponsored perhaps by the IIRSM, the CIPD. So boards are already getting quite a lot of information on what, let's say, a good corporate culture might look like and what some of the dimensions of that might be. Now, as we see in health and safety, I guess, there are lots of potentially different models around safety culture and lots of active debate on LinkedIn as to what is and what isn't safety culture and all the rest of it. Rather than perhaps just take it into that specialist area and some of those debates straight away, I think part of the value of this and this more strategic conversation is that certainly in the first instance, we can link in with some of that interest and use some of that work that's going on to make the point that in fact, some of those common pillars are the same. So for instance, and again, I'm limited on time today, but I could show you models of organizational culture where they have put leadership at the center. They've talked about the board culture. They've talked about that, how that influences the organizational culture. And it's very interesting and useful in effect to be able to say to the board, this isn't just a specialist health and safety subject. These are very similar sorts of things that you're recognizing now are important for a well-run organization. So I would say in the first instance, take a step back from assuming that this is a specialist subject that the experts have to deal with to try to facilitate that overall conversation about why organizational culture is important, what some of the key references might be, maybe linking with some of the work that's already happening in the organization or some of the other people who might be looking at this topic, and see whether that could be pulled together, if you like, to generate that initial interest before getting into the real detail, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. And also, just from your point of view, do you think there's been more of a focus towards health, safety, and environment, sustainability, and business continuity? Do you think businesses are taking it more seriously?
I certainly think a number of them are, yes. It does vary perhaps depending on the particular business, and none of us I guess are gullible enough to think that having a corporate social responsibility report makes you green or caring or whatever. The truth is in the reality, I guess, and whether those espoused values are lived in practice. But they certainly provide very good, again, levers to sort of get into some of these conversations, and in some ways maybe to test out some of this stuff. So for instance, I go to a lot of organizations now that have done quite a lot of work, perhaps in recent years, about this point about values, particularly if it's an organization maybe perhaps of any size or forward looking or whatever, they'll be looking at the values. So, in terms of perhaps delivering some form of health and safety training or trying to get that buy-in with the board, sometimes it's quite easy to do that and to facilitate the discussion around some of those values by asking the question, not just of the board, I guess, well, what are the values, but how do these potentially link in with health and safety, or what does this mean for health, safety and health and well-being if these values are the ones that the organization is now committed to? So yes, it's happening. Yes, it's happening in some places better than others. But even in the places perhaps where there may still be a bit of a gap between the theory and the practice, it provides a really good opportunity to, as I would say, and perhaps as I did a bit earlier, constructively challenge and maybe facilitate a conversation around some of these things.
Yeah, I think, like I said, I think that's the key into it, is having that conversation, bringing it to the forefront of the people's minds at the shop floor level, right up to the board level, and like I said, just being open and honest and discussing it. I think that's
just a case in point. companies, going back to this point about context, I could think of a company recently that had some dealings with that are very much moving from I guess, a large, let's say, SME to a company now that is changing its profile in terms of its product offering, its clients, the people it's going to be doing business, their expectations, how they look at the organization. And health and safety very much needs to move, and they recognize this, from something, I guess, that there was more, well, we need to do that, to something that is not only going to be an expectation of the people we're now working with, but actually they're going to attach quite a lot of proactive and positive value to our approach in this area. So even companies that perhaps have been a bit hard bitten, should we say, up to that point, changing circumstances, talking through this issue of context, having these more strategic conversations, do quite often turn up some really interesting discussion points that we can, I think, help to sort of hang things onto.
Yeah, definitely. Well, that's brilliant, Neil. I don't think we've got any more questions, and I think we're about at time. So I think there's nothing else left to do than to thank you for your time. Thank you for joining us. And for all those that joined on the webinar, thank you very much. Like I say, we'll go on to YouTube, and I'm pretty sure we'll get a lot more views on there as well.
Okay, well, thanks for the invite again. Hopefully that's given people some food for thought. And genuinely, if it's a subject of interest to you, don't hesitate to come back to me. Always happy to discuss and make some suggestions.
Great, thank you, Neil, and thank you, Dan. Yeah, I'll upload the recording onto the YouTube channel in the next day or two, so you should be able to watch it then. So it just leaves me to say good evening to everyone. I hope you have a good evening, and see you at the next East Midlands branch webinar. Bye, everyone.
Thanks,
Okay,
Julie.
goodbye.
Thanks, Neil. Bye.